I really want to like Reign of Reflections. I really do. It does many things right. In fact, on the gameplay front, there's very little I can complain about. The game is a mix between adventure game and turn-based strategy game, and the playtime is evenly divided between the two. During combat, the game mostly resembles XCOM. So you have a handful of action points each turn which you can use to move around the battlefield and act against your enemies. There is an emphasis on stealth in here as well that I very much like, where the enemies aren't immediately alerted to your presence and you can even evade them since they only see your last known position. You can also talk during combat in order to affect both your team's and the enemy's morale, which is a really neat idea. So often, taunting just means drawing aggro, but here it actually has a buff or debuff impact on the combatants. Outside of combat, you're free to explore your surroundings, inspect objects, talk to people, and also hack computers. The hacking minigames are pretty much the only other gameplay aspect besides the combat, and for what it's worth, the 3 different kinds of hacking minigame you have to do are all entertaining enough little puzzles that they don't outstay their welcome. The game also tries to use dialogue as gameplay, in the sense that you can for example choose to hang up on people calling you without hearing them out, but overall dialogue isn't employed in this manner all that extensively. While that idea is nice, it's severely underutilized. That term right there, severely underutilized, is probably how I would describe most things in Reign of Reflections. And the reason for it is that the game is barely 3.5 hours long, and that's if you're thorough like me and click on absolutely everything, and also if you take your time to be stealthy during combat encounters. I understand that the game is only supposed to be a chapter 1 of an intended trilogy of stories. However, I wasn't expecting it to be like a literal first chapter of a novel that only introduces you to the world and characters but never elaborates on anything. The setting is basically ripped straight from Children of Men. It's the cyberpunk future, it's always nighttime, it always rains, and humanity has become infertile, where nobody has been able to have children anymore. Predictably, there is one miraculous childbirth after decades, and of course that's a big deal. The child is currently held captive in some kind of laboratory, and your character's goal is to set them free, as the title of the chapter implies, because they believe that the child shouldn't be treated as a lab rat. So the goal is clear: infiltrate the lab and get the kid out. The first hurdle happens when your character's mother, a politician, wants to bring you out of the city because of some terrorist attacks that have happened recently. You have to defy her orders, break out of your own apartment and sneak past her entourage, which acts as a tutorial for the turn-based mechanics. After that, you steal a cab and ride to the slums, which you have to pass through for some reason to get to the lab. The slums are mostly there to flesh out the world and give you some opportunity to talk to some people. Your aim here is to get to the other side of the waterways and meet up with a friend who has managed to procure a boat to pass down the canals. Once you end up there, the guy currently occupying the building you're trying to pass through engages you in a combat encounter because your friend didn't actually buy the boat from him, he just stole it. You deal with him either lethally or non-lethally and exit the building through a large drain pipe, and somehow you magically end up at the lab compound. I mean, I'm glad we got to skip the sewer level entirely, but it feels like this entire detour through the slums doesn't sensibly lead to where it should. Anyway, once you're there are a couple of hacking challenges and 2 additional combat encounters before you get into the lab itself and attempt to rescue the child. At that point, your dad of all people shows up and prohibits you from going through with it. Turns out that both your partner and your character are employees at the lab where the child is held and that your dad is the head researcher on the project. Why the fuck did we need to do this entire spiel with the slums and infiltrating the lab when you could have just walked through the front door? In any case, your dad confronts you and your friend, has him apprehended and chastises you a bit before leaving. At this point, you're supposed to hack back into the terminal that lets you rescue the child, but that predictably fails because you were informed previously that the security measures are impossible to bypass. So what now? Well, you do the next best thing, which is rescue a couple of reflections of the child, which I guess are this narrative's term for clones, although it's never made clear if that's what they actually are. This again sets off the alarms, which prompts your dad to return with some armed guards. Only now the guards are no longer listening to him and attempt to arrest you too, until just at the right moment your mom interjects and orders the guards to stand down. Your dad ends up letting you leave with the 2 clones, and once you exit the lab you encounter some dude pointing a gun at you, and then the game just ends. We literally just did the equivalent of planting the first set of explosives in the Mako reactor in Final Fantasy VII, and that's all you get. I've never been a fan of these episodic games, especially not when all the episodes haven't come out yet. But I was under the impression that this would be a complete experience, because that's what the developers claim, since all 3 chapters are supposed to focus on different aspects of the world and have different protagonists. But this first chapter really isn't a complete experience at all. It throws in the bare minimum of world building, introduces the setting, characters, and their relationships to each other, but it never delves deeper into anything. You can't just make a pretty cyberpunk world and have that do all the heavy lifting. You actually have to tell a compelling story and populate your world with believable characters. And that's just not the case here. And I do mean that part about the pretty cyberpunk world. The game has a very nice aesthetic and the sound design is top-notch as well. The voice acting is a little hit or miss and the animations are somewhat stilted in certain spots, but the overall presentation is nice. But that can prop up this entire enterprise. I hope they'll at least try to continue this series, and maybe once it's complete it's worth buying. I assume though that they've run out of capital at this point, which is why this title has been appearing in multiple cheap bundles, which is where I got it from. My guess is that this is an attempt at acquiring some more capital to either finish the next chapter or do something else entirely. The bottom line is that until the former of those two things happens, I can't really recommend Reign of Reflections. 5 combat encounters including the tutorial, a handful of puzzles and hacking challenges, and the inciting incident part of a story simply aren't enough.